Welcome to the channel, where we delve into the mind of a villain. In this century, we'll be taking a look at Kilgrave, as played by David Tennant from the first season of Jessica Jones. A diabolical villain with the ability to take away one's free will with just a word, Kilgrave's presence was an ominous one, bringing a foreboding sense of doom that not many antagonists can match. With his ability to command people to do his every bidding, no matter how absurd or fatal his requests may be, Kilgrave leaves a long trail of victims, with many dead, and those that survive either wish to die or live broken lives, all while he enjoys another 5-star hotel stay and the finest food that money can buy. For some, the devil made me do it might be an excuse that they may make to justify their actions. But for Kilgrave's victims, it is very much an accurate statement to say that they had hardly any choice in the matter. In this video, we'll be covering his characteristics and his beliefs, as well as his attitudes and motivations. A tall and well-groomed man, sharply dressed in fine suits, with slick hair and neatly maintained facial stubble, one would readily assume Kilgrave as a person of class, combined with his rich British accent and polished manner of speaking. Indeed, one of the apparent traits of Kilgrave is his pride over his social status and his corresponding disdain for those he deems below him. We see this in a relatively minor interaction with a store owner, where Kilgrave just helps himself to his items while he protests. While he could use his powers to silence him, Kilgrave couldn't even be bothered, but instead does one of the most insulting things one can do to another person, treating them as if they didn't exist. He continues to ignore him and pretend he isn't there, but only has his attention diverted when the man makes physical contact. This sets Kilgrave off, who promptly commands the man to splash his hot cup of coffee onto his face as punishment for the insult of his touch. Kilgrave's sense of class is also seen by his repulsion with fast food and with him being labeled a food snob by Jessica. His attire is something he also takes pride in, typically clad in a monochromatic dark suit with a pair of matching Oxfords, likely due to him frequenting the night establishments. When he first meets Jessica, he is seen mocking her for her horrible sense of fashion. A recurring theme with Kilgrave is his ability to acquit himself. In his eyes, he sees himself as innocent. Kilgrave's evil can be traced back to his traumatic childhood, but even in his own recount of his past, he presents a one-sided view, portraying his parents as evil scientists who turned him into a lab rat for their experiments, while conveniently leaving out the part where they were doing what they needed to save him. Before he was Kilgrave, he was Kevin, a boy suffering from a neurodegenerative disease that would claim his life by the time he was 12. With no other option left, his parents resorted to an experimental study in an attempt to repair his damaged DNA. The process was torturous for young Kevin, as seen by how Kilgrave cannot bear to re-watch the footage even as an adult. Somewhere along the process, Kevin developed his power to command people, starting with his parents. As one would expect, havoc could only ensue. After a horrifying incident involving a clothes iron, Kevin's parents decided to abandon him in an effort to save themselves, as they recount being constantly terrorized by him. Much can be said of the failure of Kevin's father and mother. Ultimately, their son was their responsibility, something they only accepted much later, and leaving him to himself was the worst thing they could have done. Every life that Kilgrave has destroyed is on them. At the very least, they should have returned to him and either sought help to treat his condition or take escalated measures should things go awry. Despite his evil, Kilgrave remains a lost child who desires reconciliation with his parents, as seen by how he sincerely apologizes to his mother for the hurt he's caused. With no one to look after him, Kevin would rely on his newfound ability, being able to command strangers, to take care of his every need. Nothing was withheld from him. But obviously, this would be detrimental to his growth as a person, as part of developing maturity is learning to handle rejection. Having everyone accede to your every request is a surefire recipe for becoming a spoilt, entitled child. Over time, he adopted the name Kilgrave instead, making the world his chessboard, with him being the king and everyone else his pawns. One would shudder at the thought of him knocking at the door, as every command he makes is a Jedi mind trick that cannot be resisted, unless, of course, headphones are worn. But despite being able to have everything he wants, Kilgrave appears to be rather small-minded. If world domination was his ambition, it stands to reason that he could certainly have it fairly easily. Instead, he settles for a life of mere luxury, staying in fancy hotels, watching rugby, and eating rich food, a life which he finds unsatisfying and meaningless. That is, until he meets the woman known as Jessica Jones. Perhaps it is part of human nature that we want things we cannot have. Forbidden fruit always tastes sweeter. Jessica is the only individual who has shown immunity to Kilgrave's powers, and this is one major reason that he is drawn to her. Being able to tell everyone what to do might sound great, but it doesn't fulfill the universal need that we all have, the need for affection and acceptance. Kilgrave knows that despite his powers, he is unable to force someone to genuinely love him. He could command someone to say, "I love you," but the sincerity of that statement would be most doubtful. However, he believes that Jessica genuinely loves him, based on the fact that during the 18 seconds after the end of his 12-hour window of control over her, she still chose to stay with him instead of leaving. Such is the extent of Kilgrave's delusion and desperate need for love, that he would base his assumption of Jessica's love on these 18 seconds. As one would expect of Kilgrave, his maturity is stunted. A dilemma that he gripes about is that he cannot tell if someone is doing what they want or what he is telling them to do. With Jessica, he doesn't have this problem, as she is no longer subject to his commanding influence. Kilgrave has an unhealthy obsession with Jessica, to the point where he commits heinous acts to get her attention, most notably the abduction of Hope Schlottman and the death of her parents. He is possessive over her, as seen by his hostile attitude towards her neighbor, Reuben and Luke Cage, both of whom have shown a romantic interest in Jessica. However, his attempts to win her over shows just how out of touch he is with reality. Kilgrave would go to great lengths, buying her childhood home and painstakingly recreating it down to the last detail, as she mentions that her childhood was her happiest moment. To appeal to Jessica's sense of morality, he even does it by the book, paying for it with cash and ensuring that the previous owner was satisfied with the sale. In his delusional state, Kilgrave believes that this dramatic gesture would change her mind about him. For a time, he appears to be content living the suburban life with Jessica, telling her that they are inevitable and that she, of all people, should understand him, as they both had their powers forced upon them. For a time, Jessica entertains the notion of staying with Kilgrave, with the possibility of using his powers for good. Kilgrave himself is enthused by the idea, even expressing some excitement over his newfound life purpose of becoming a hero, which alludes to how meaningless he felt his existence was. Earlier on, we see him dismiss his two female companions for Jessica, for the reason that they bore him. Kilgrave's attempt to be good, although brief, reveals much of his psyche. Despite his crimes, he does not abhor himself, but rather he sees himself as innocent, downplaying his atrocities by justifying himself. This key trait of his bears repeating, given how central it is to his mindset. Although Jessica hates him, and rightfully so, Kilgrave is so out of touch with reality that he maintains that he treated her well, better than anyone else has at least, and cannot understand her resentment of him. He refutes the accusation that he violated her, and even mentions that he hates the word. Kilgrave's self-justification can be summed up in the following 2 words: flexible morality. He has a selective conscience where he twists each situation to preserve his self-image and deflect guilt. This is summed up in a brief but significant moment where he tells Hogarth, "I'm a man of my word, if I feel like it." When Jessica brings up the fact that he's killed people, Kilgrave objects, saying that he's never killed anyone but that they killed themselves. It's a terribly flimsy excuse, and it speaks to his psychopathy if he truly believes it. This harkens back to the point where he says he cannot tell whether people are doing what they want or what he is telling them. To alleviate his guilt, Kilgrave hides behind the ambiguity of his commands, saying that his victims ultimately chose how they interpret them. As preposterous as it may sound, there is a certain small element of truth in his claim. This is seen most notably in his escape, when he tells Trish to put a bullet in her head. Instead of shooting herself, we find that Kilgrave's command can be fulfilled when she simply puts the bullet into her mouth, making it effectively inside her head. With Jessica, he defends himself by saying that he never asked her to kill Riva, but only asked her to take care of her, emphasizing that it was Jessica who chose to interpret it as punching her. Bottom line, when it comes to his selective conscience, if his victims' actions don't align with his sense of morality, then it is completely their fault, either due to their own interpretation of his instructions, or they were simply doing what they wanted to do. Either way, the fault is not his, absolving him of any guilt. However, the more time he spends with Jessica, it appears that Kilgrave slowly starts to see his error. He indirectly admits his guilt when he brings up the topic of moral math, asking how many lives he would need to save to make up for the lives he took. But overall, his self-justification still remains, particularly when it comes to those he despises. We see this when he condemns the abusive husband, saying that he will never become a productive member of society and is better off dead. Later on, in his attempt to repair his image with Jessica, he goes so far as to label his actions as a public service by ridding society of its nuisances. He consoles himself with the fact that while he doesn't give a second thought to those he lets die, at least he doesn't take pleasure in their deaths, as he puts forth that only a truly evil person would do so. For a time, it appears that Kilgrave could possibly be reformed under Jessica's care, but there was no time to let that play out, as Jessica needed to prove Hope's innocence before she is jailed for life. Unfortunately, she chooses to abduct Kilgrave, when she could probably negotiate with him peacefully to secure her release as penance for his actions. When he realizes that he has no chance of winning Jessica back, Kilgrave resorts to enhancing his powers in an attempt to control her again. Initially, he is motivated by revenge, but eventually we see that he is still emotionally attached to her, with the goal of forcing her to want him so that he can reject her over and over. At the end, he is deceived into thinking that his powers work on her again. But what's tragic is that he is now content with an artificial relationship based on his persuasive power and not of her own free will. Tragic and pathetic, Kilgrave was a villain whose power was a double-edged sword. While it gave him everything he wanted in the material sense, it corrupted him into a monster and made him emotionally bankrupt. To preserve his self-image, he adopted a flexible sense of morality and a selective conscience, shifting the blame away from himself to his victims. So what do you think of Kilgrave, folks? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and take care.